All right, welcome everybody to session 5, the last session of our conference on comparative analysis of platform governance in the United States and China. Today, we're talking about payments and cryptocurrency, and our moderator is the Swiss scholar Rolf Weber, and I will turn it over to him. Take it away, Rolf.
Okay, thank you very much, Milton. As you have already said, this afternoon or morning in the United States or night in China, we are going to look at payment systems. In principle, platforms are venues that allow the transactional exchange of products and services, and products and services have been discussion topic over the last 2 days. So usually, with the exception of search engines, the consummation of the products and services is not free of charge, since the respective goods and services do have a certain value. Consequently, payments, as so to speak, the backside of the medal, are equally important, even if not being in the main focus of the platform governance discussions. Being a law professor and knowing, so to speak, the legal discipline, I obviously look at the question to what extent regulatory mechanisms would have to be implemented in respect of payment systems in connection with platforms. And all overall, and without taking now any position before we are going to hear the 3 interesting presentations, all overall appropriate regulation appears to be justified in order to address risk and provide a legal level playing field. And we have seen respective developments in China and in the United States over the last few years. Let me now turn to the first presentation. The first presentation on issues of sovereign digital currencies and the US-China global digital techno competition. Quite often we use the abbreviation CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currencies, and I'm pleased to introduce to you the 2 speakers for this presentation. On the one hand, Dr. Ying Huang. She works as a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn in Germany. On the other hand, Ms. Roujing. She's an intern at the same center at the University of Bonn. I'm looking forward to this presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
谢谢韦伯先生。大家好，我是德国波恩大学高级安全战略与一体化研究中心研究员黄颖。今天我将与我的同事吴柔静一起向大家汇报一下我们对主权数字货币与中美全球数字技术竞争的一些思考。数字经济浪潮下，全球数字货币发展迅猛，法定货币数字化进程不断加速。2020年第4季度，国际清算银行调查了65家央行，其中有86%的央行正在进行央行数字货币的一些工作。从这张图中我们可以看到，大部分国家都处于央行数字货币的研发阶段，很多国家已经认识到数字货币对
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the translator, you're speaking English on the Chinese channel. You need to switch to the English channel so that the English people can get you.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Can I continue?
你就用中文说可以了，你用中文可以，没关系的。他是说那个同传的问题，不是你的问题。
好，谢谢老师。我们可以看到，很多国家已经认识到数字货币对全球数字经济和地缘政治的重要性，国家间围绕数字货币的竞争也日趋激烈。虽然在数字货币方面，中美两国暂时未出现正面交锋，但数字货币很可能成为中美两国战略博弈的新焦点。因为双方关系可能因两国在发展数字货币和管理机制上的差异变得更为紧张。本次报告我们主要探讨中美主权数字货币发展现状和治理机制，以及如何影响中美全球数字技术竞争的。首先，由我的同事吴柔静来界定数字货币的相关概念。
好，谢谢黄颖。
目前，不同国家和机构对数字货币的定义有所不同。基于本文的研究对象，我们将采用国际清算银行的定义，将数字货币定义为以数字形式表示的资产，其中包含电子货币、虚拟货币和加密货币。电子货币是政府发行或监督承认的法定货币的数字代表，虚拟货币是由开发人员控制和创建，并在特定社区中获得价值。比如 Q 币是由腾讯公司所开发，可以在腾讯开发的游戏中购买道具的。而加密货币，比如比特币，是数字货币的加密形式，其价值在全球投资市场上仍然非常不稳定。接下来，为了理清数字货币的不同种类，我们制作了一个集合来解释货币按照是否超越国家主权，可划分为主权货币和超主权货币。这两种货币都有数字货币的形式。数字货币这个概念是相对于传统货币的概念而言的，它可以跨越中央银行和商业银行，成为超主权数字货币，冲击一些弱势主权法币的地位。我们再从发行主体来看，数字货币可分为央行数字货币和私人数字货币。其中，央行数字货币是具有主权性和法偿性的纯数字化货币，由国家的主管货币当局发行和监管，而私人数字货币多指并无发行机构或由非中心化的私人机构发行，它主要运用了具有去中心化、去信任化、可追溯性特征的区块链技术，比特币就是其中的典型代表。这两种数字货币之间的根本区别在于，央行数字货币具有传统法定货币的全部职能，由央行统一发行和维护管理。而以比特币为代表的私人数字货币则没有发行主体，而是基于区块链共识机制节点民主决定并共同维护。在本次会议背景下，我们进一步分析了数字货币与数字基础设施和数字支付平台的关系。通过研究，我们发现数字货币是数字经济的一个重要基础设施，关系到一个国家在世界经济体中的站位。数字货币不仅本身是数字基础设施，还由其他基础设施构成。例如，数字人民币所用到的基础设施就包括认证中心、可信服务管理模块、大数据分析中心等。其中，以大数据分析中心为例，它主要运用了像大数据、云计算技术等技术来分析客户交易行为，保障数字货币交易安全，规避违法行为等。而数字货币与数字支付平台之间既有区别又有联系。以中国为例，微信和支付宝是金融基础设施，就是钱包，而数字人民币则是钱包里的内容。电子支付场景下，微信和支付宝的这个钱包里装的是商业银行存款货币。数字人民币发行后，大家仍然可以用微信、支付宝进行支付，只不过钱包里就是我们多了数字人民币。也就是说，像微信、支付宝还有 PayPal 这样的电子支付工具，它与账户是紧密耦合的。现在央行设计的数字货币是采用账户松耦合和账户钱包的方式，也就是说，大家不用将银行卡与微信等进行捆绑，就能完成支付交易。它可以脱离银行账户限制，实现端到端的转移，并且在央行允许的范围内实现可控的匿名支付。好，接下来将由我的同事黄颖来介绍中美主权数字货币发展现状与治理机制。
好，谢谢柔静。当前中美主权数字货币发展处于不同的发展阶段。首先，我们来看一下中国。2014年，中国就启动了数字人民币的研究。最近，中国各地又推出了一些试点项目。中国人民银行致力于成为首个发行数字货币的主要央行，以推动人民币国际化，并降低对美元主导的全球银行系统的依赖。当前，中国正努力让外国运动员和游客在2022年北京冬奥会期间使用其数字货币。这可能是中国数字货币对国际用户的首次测试。2020年初，美国数字美元基金会启动了数字美元计划，并鼓励业内专家对数字美元潜在优势进行研究以及公开讨论，同时开始商讨建立本国央行数字货币可能采取的实际操作框架及步骤。曾于2017年被搁置的美联储 Fedcoin 计划再次被提出。据最新消息报道，美联储将推出美国加密区块链技术 Fedcoin， 并在全国推广。另外，去年创立数字美元项目，旨在促进对美国央行数字货币的研究。他于今年5月宣布，他在未来12个月内将推出至少5个试点项目，以衡量美国央行数字货币或数字美元的价值，并为其未来设计提供参考。中美两国主权数字货币发展现状是由其对数字货币的基本态度所决定的。比较中美对数字货币的态度，我们可以发现，中国政府和专家学者他普遍认为，数字货币对中国参与数字领域的国际竞争具有重要意义。数字人民币将大大便利人民币的跨境清算，更好助力人民币国际化进程，同时可以提高对资金流动的监管能力，使货币政策的传导更加的精准。特别是2017年的9月以来，政府出于保护投资者和预防金融风险的目的，采取了一系列的监管措施，打击与加密货币有关的活动。由此看来，中国它不太可能批准超主权货币在中国运行。不过，中国鼓励和支持金融创新与金融基础设施建设，支持研究中国金融机构主导的超主权数字货币的可行性以及实践方案。我们再来看一下美国对央行数字货币的态度，主要表现在美联储主席鲍威尔与前不久的表态。他表示，美元是世界储备货币，这意味着美元在世界各地交易中的使用率远远超过其他货币。在数字货币方面，美国不用急于行动。从他的表述，我们可以看出，美国对发展主权数字货币还是非常谨慎的。有专家认为，央行数字货币的推出有可能触发货币权力的分散，从而削弱美元在全球金融体系中的中心地位。在超主权数据货币方面，美国的态度同样非常的谨慎，主要体现在美国各方对 Libra 的态度上。2019年的6月。Facebook 发布了 Libra 白皮书，最初的它的设想是把 Libra 发展成为一个与美元、欧元等一篮子主权货币挂钩的通用数字货币，也就是说是一个超主权的货币。但是 Libra 加密货币计划遭到了多名美国国会议员可能挑战美元地位的指责和全球监管机构的强烈反对。2020年的12月 ，Facebook 官网宣布把 Libra改名为 DIM 将主要业务随后就从瑞士转移到了美国，纳入到了美国的监管范围。它的目的就是为了消减美国对超主权数字货币威胁美元主导地位的担忧，以获得监管部门的批准。我们总的来看，美国对央行数字的货币是有所缓和的。那首先就是因为中国推进数字货币计划，给美国考虑创建数字美元提供了新的动力，而且除了中国之外，欧元区和瑞典等都在进行数字货币的转型，发展数字货币已成为一个国际的潮流，美国它必须做出一个回应。再就是随着 DIM 的启动，美联储也越发的重视数字货币，它可能成为美国启动其央行数字货币的一个重要的催化剂。目前，由于各国缺乏对数字货币的统一认识，其监管方式和政策也是不尽相同的。在对数字货币的监管中，中国严格区分央行数字货币以及私人数字货币。对于央行数字货币，中国政府会全力维持央行在数字人民币发行中的中心化的管理地位。不过，中国不承认私人数字货币的法定货币地位，对私人数字货币有着较为严格的监管标准，禁止其作为货币在市场流通。但是，私人货币作为虚拟财产的法律属性却未被中国法律法规或监管规则所禁止。在金融创新与发展方面，美国一直走在世界的前列，是全球数字货币发展的主要市场之一。早在2013年，美国的金融监管部门对数字货币的实质性监管就已经开始了，并形成了联邦和州2个层次的监管体系。我们从监管机构可以看，以功能性监管为主，多分散于行政职权机构的部门监管，它并无统一的监管规则，这一点是和中国是不一样的。而从内容来看， 将数字货币的监管纳入现有金融监管体系之中，而非新设监管机构进行监管。报告的最后一部分，我们来看一下数字货币的对抗的本质给中美关系带来哪些影响。我们知道，数字货币它既是技术问题，也是政策和战略问题。这里首先体现了主权数字货币的普遍性矛盾。为了应对超主权货币对本国货币体系和金融体系的冲击，多国积极启动开发和试点央行数字货币计划，为了打造安全和独立的本土法定数字货币。但是数字货币是跨境的，它具有全球性。目前多国央行都注意到，由于全球缺乏统一的央行数字货币技术研发标准，贸然使用某一种技术，反而会给本国数字货币跨境支持应用带来诸多麻烦。它其中就包括本国数字货币与全球制定的标准不够统一，那么与其他国家数字货币兼容等一些问题就会出现。主权与超主权数字货币的发展，它涉及到了货币主权之争。推出数字人民币是中国的重要战略举措，是否推出数字美元也是战略决策。首先，这是一场有关货币主权的零和游戏。一个国家的货币被其他国家的数字货币所取代，那本国的主权货币的地位就面临严峻的挑战。从中国视角来看，中国大力推进数字货币计划，积极参与数字领域的国际竞争，它就是为了巩固金融和数字主权，加强人民币的国际化进程，来降低美元在其经济体系中的地位。但是如果数字人民币它不能纳入到超主权数字货币体系的话，那么中国将面临人民币国际化方面的诸多挑战。美国自然也是希望能够维护美元在国际金融体系中的主导地位。未来超主权数字货币的发展一定会给数字人民币以及未来可能出现的数字美元带来巨大的冲击。中美对主权数字货币和超主权数字货币不同的监管思路，将可能加剧中美全球数字技术竞争。其次，我们发现这是一场有关标准权利的博弈。中国数字人民币最大的竞争风险，其实在于欧美7个国家现在正在积极制定包括主权和私人数字货币的一个标准，其中 DIM 可被视为潜在的竞争风险。它拥有30亿的全球用户基础，一旦获得批准，很有可能迅速成为全球性的一个超主权货币。而超主权数字货币可能重构全球货币和金融体系。超主权数字货币它不一定有一个明确的国别标签，但是它最为重要的是公众认可的一个全球性的商业信用。中国希望在国际数字货币监管标准制定中争取更多的话语权，希望通过积极推进数字人民币，加快制定数字货币的基础标准，完善国内法，以推动中国优势数字货币技术转化为国际标准。但是目前中国是被排除在外的。日本央行正在与美联储、欧洲央行等共同研究中央数字货币的核心功能，为了是加快制定央行数字货币的一个共同规则。在此，中美两国围绕数字货币竞争的实质在于结构性权力的博弈。掌握数字货币创新技术，它有利于决定各国央行数字货币流通和监管标准，借此控制全球的金融结构。所谓结构性的权利，它是一种塑造和决定各种政治经济结构的权利，它主要表现为一个行为者对过程和结构的一种控制。它不同于我们平时说的一个行为者对另外一个行为者施加影响的一个这种关系性权利。围绕数字货币，中美两国都期望能够主导各国央行数字货币流通和监管标准，控制全球的金融结构，通过数字货币来增强其在全球数字经济中的国际竞争优势。据国际货币基金组织的数据显示，2020年第4季度，美国在全球外汇储备中所占比例，它已经降到了25年的最低水平，大概为59.2%。虽然当前美元仍是占主导地位的国际货币储备货币，但是未来主权和超主权数字货币无疑会给国际货币体系带来结构性的变革。那么，数字人民币是否会威胁美元的主导地位呢？在发展主权数字货币方面，中国的优势非常明显，就是数字人民币在央行数字货币应用领域还处于现在是全球领先的一个地位。 而美、欧、日还处于对央行数字货币进行可行性研究的阶段。第二呢，是数字人民币在技术架构上，它放弃了完全的使用区块链，而是集成了一部分成熟的中心化的技术。这里面我看到一个技术的创新。中国拥有自己的数字货币技术能力和监管标准，它有利于维护中国在数字货币和金融方面的自主性和安全性。第三就是我们知道，将数字人民币嵌入到数字丝绸之路倡议之中，将有利于数字人民的国际化以及市场化。当然，中国的劣势在这里面，在数字货币竞争中的也是非常明显的。当前被排除在国际数字货币标准制定之外，还有就是数字人民币应用场景，它首先是在国内，在国际上推行，它具有先天的弱势。全球外汇储备中，中国的份额仅占2.25%，这一点它极大的限制了数字人民币成为一个有规模的数字储备货币。再次，未来主权数字货币是和超主权数字货币在同一个维度、同一个领域产生竞争。那么，数字人民币最大的竞争对手是现在我们所说的私人数字货币。如果DIM超主权数字货币成功建立了一个全球支付系统，它不仅可以获得全球用户的数据实力，还能巩固美元的霸权。美国的优势，我们来看，虽然美国在央行数字货币领域稍微落后一点，但是它在私人数字领域，它的技术还是有很大的优势。不排除美联储以私人数字货币为工具来应对其他央行数字货币的崛起，这是一个非常有效的一个手段。第二，美元的主导地位，它有利于其主权数字货币的发展。美国的劣势在于主权数字货币研发和试点方面它相对落后，美国各方还对数字货币存有很大的质疑，然后非常担心数字货币央行数字货币能够威胁美元在国际货币体系中的主导地位。平衡创新和监管是美国政府目前需要解决的一个巨大难题。好，至于数字人民币是否会威胁美元的地位，通过研究，我们的答案是不会直接，但会间接影响。虽然中国是当下央行数字货币进程最快的国家，但仅靠数字人民币无法取代美元的主导地位。不过，数字人民币引发的央行数字货币浪潮可能会加剧全球金融体系碎片化，为全球货币事务引入类似于权力平衡的东西。数字货币潮流将对现存的国际货币体系产生冲击，其中就包括威胁美元作为世界储备货币的一个地位。人类正在步入数字货币时代，数字货币本身的跨区域性、全球性对于国际监管合作以及全球治理都提出了新的要求。如何打造安全、独立的本土法定数字货币，应对外来势力的数字货币对本国货币体系和金融体制的冲击，给各国政府和专家都提出了巨大的技术以及政策的挑战。而只有积极的与其他国家开展多边数字金融合作，共同给数字货币制定标准和确定治理规范，才能够更好的维护全球的金融和政治稳定。我们的报告就到这里，谢谢大家。
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure that your issues that you have presented will give rise to much food in the discussion. Let me just recall, in general, presentations should be not longer than 20 minutes. You were almost as precise as a Swiss watch, but just as a general remark, it is worthwhile to keep some time for the discussion. According to the program, we don't discuss your presentation just now, but we proceed. And in particular, we are going to listen now to Colin, Kiernan, and Shen, addressing the issue comparing US digital payment systems development to China's Alipay and WeChat duopoly. Colin, Kiernan from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Shen from the Carnegie Mellon University. You have the floor.
Hi, my name is Colin Kiernan. I'm a recent graduate of the Master's Program in Georgia Tech in cybersecurity. And I'm here today as an independent contributor to the Internet Governance Project. For our contribution, Dr. Shen and I will discuss US and Chinese mobile payment systems, their development, and policy issues surrounding inclusiveness and privacy. The US is increasingly cashless, only it's mostly going to plastic. with some degree of mobile as well. In 2018, the Federal Reserve noted that for the first time in history, check payments fell below the number of automated clearinghouse or ACH debit transfers in the US, indicating that electronic payments have eclipsed cash handling and checks. To understand the scope of that, according to the latest Federal Reserve payment study, in 2018, card payments in the US totaled over $7 trillion in value, accounting for 75% of all non-cash transactions made, which includes both check and debits. By contrast, the total volume of mobile wallet payments made in the US in the same year was only 112 billion. Market research firm eMarketer reported that in 2020, there was a 29% jump in the number of mobile payments during the height of the pandemic, and projects that by 2025, approximately half of all smartphone users will utilize some form of mobile payment. In my review of the literature, there are two main reasons why mobile payments have not been adopted in the US to the same level as seen elsewhere in the world and in China. The first is the ubiquitous credit card payment infrastructure that's developed over the last couple of decades, and the incumbent interchange fee models that have developed around that to the tune of north of 100 billion in revenue a year based on fees alone. And number two is less trust amongst US consumers in digital payment technology, as well as confusion over a fractured ecosystem. So mentioning the fractured nature of the mobile payments ecosystem in the United States, to kind of go back in time, this is not an immature technology in the United States necessarily. In 2006, mobile pay was introduced with PayPal. It was envisioned as a text message-based service for small to medium businesses, or SMBs. And to put that in perspective, that predates the iPhone launch in 2007. Since that time, other financial technology innovations have come along, including Square by Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey in 2010, which attempts to transform commercial off-the-shelf smartphone devices into payment terminals, or otherwise known as point of sale or POS terminals, which is normally the purview of a handful of companies globally. Verifone, the US company Verifone, being one of them, who enjoys a massive global market share with an annual revenue north of 100 billion US per year. We also have further complicating our mobile payment ecosystem here, what we call private label mobile payment apps, like those seen with Starbucks, Walmart, and independent retailers. These are usually attached to reward programs for exclusive use in those stores. More recently, in 2013 through 2015, we saw the launch of peer-to-peer transaction platforms. There's Cash App by Square, Venmo, which is now a subsidiary of PayPal, as well as Apple Pay and Google Pay, which launched in 2014 and 2015, respectively. According to eMarketer, you can kind of see the layout of the number of consumers adopting each platform. It's significantly skewed towards Apple Pay, but number two is Starbucks, exclusively for use in one retail chain. So when we discuss mobile payments in our paper, we focus on the infrastructure at the point of sale largely, and in the United States versus China, there's the ubiquity of near-field communication, or NFC technology, versus quick response codes is slightly, well, it's dramatically different than what you find in China. We have far more what they call NFC point of sale adoption, with over 58% of merchants here accepting that, whereas 56% of merchants accept some form of mobile payment, including QR, but that's a mix of different various forms, including barcode and other means of transmission of payment. So with QR codes specifically, I think that's the innovation that is largely touted as the main innovation in China. Here in the United States, we have seen this, particularly with the private label payment platforms. at individual retail outlets, with the latest entrant in the market being PayPal, which rolled this out last year in 2020 with CVS pharmacies. So this, you can see the infrastructure is not wholly adopted across the board, with only roughly 2/3 of merchants accepting some form of contactless pay. But moving forward, I think omni-channel strategies will help alleviate this kind of confusion for U.S. consumers, as we've seen in the past, when vendors have had to deal with competing credit card networks and technologies like EMV. They've typically adopted a omni-channel strategy, which will help smooth the way for U.S. consumers in the regard of confusion with our fractured ecosystem. We have to mention the U.S. consumer attitudes have shifted dramatically since the COVID-19 pandemic. Here depicted, we have a MasterCard study published this year. These are actually global numbers, not just U.S. consumer numbers, of what consumers plan to utilize in the next year. But more specific to the U.S., there was a 2021 Visa Back to Business study that found that nearly half of all Americans surveyed in 2020 thought that contactless payment is especially important to their safety. Though interestingly, in the same Visa study, 24% of Americans said they would revert to their old methods of payment once the vaccine is widely available, which is quite higher than the global average of 16%. The other issue with adoption in the U.S. of mobile payment is security. 2019 Pew Research study found that 30% respondents would not use mobile payment for fear of losing funds. And these concerns are not unfounded. Recently, since the COVID-19 pandemic, research has come out from the Public Interest Research Group, which found a 450% increase in the number of consumer complaints regarding fraudulent transactions via mobile payment platforms like Venmo, Cash App, and Zelle. Addressing some of these concerns are security standards being developed within the past couple of years. The SDOs in this space are largely US-led, such as EMVCo and the PCI Security Standards Council, both of which released standards for mobile payment security with respect to NFC and/or QR codes. We also have an industry group here in the United States called the National Automated Clearinghouse Association, or NACHA, which governs the ACH network in the US, which is the predominant network for bank-to-bank transfers and deposits. And they've also, in just this year, published new rules for addressing mobile payment debits. Despite obviously the technical merits of mobile payment security and these different SDOs getting involved, and the ability for multi-factor authentication to, I think, do a better job than traditional credit card payment technology at the point of sale, it will likely still take some time for consumer confidence to solidify. The policy implications that I discussed on the US side center on a few key issues regarding financial regulation, inclusivity, and privacy. Mobile wallets and the so-called neobank offerings by the tech platforms running them, and how they are regulated against existing body of law is a concern. Normally, financial institutions observe the Federal Reserve Board's Regulation E, which outlines obligations of the banks when handling electronic funds transfer, or EFT disputes and errors. Toward kind of reining in mobile payment platforms, in 2019, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau instituted the prepaid account rule that classifies some forms of mobile payment as a prepaid account, and thus under Regulation E. But in 2020, PayPal had certain provisions of the rule stricken down in court, including the need for consumer disclosures about fee structures and limits to the ability to connect credit to prepaid accounts. There are also disputes over access to network infrastructure with mobile payments. Senator Durbin in 2021 proposed an amendment with the Federal Reserve Board took up to require card issues to allow at least 2 networks for vendors to choose from when processing payments. The idea is to create conditions for competition in fee structures instead of locking into one preferred credit card network that may be more expensive. The mobile payment platforms and the credit card companies attached to them have been able to kind of monopolize this infrastructure because of regulation that has language regarding the use of PINs, requiring choice in the payment networks to be used. And since PINs, by their nature, are not used in contactless payment, vendors have complained, and there is Senator Durbin's proposal with the Federal Reserve Board taking it up to implement this as a rule, that they would have to follow, contactless payments would have to follow the 2-network minimum choice for vendors in processing payments. Is there a mobile divide in the US that we should be concerned about? As for inclusivity and the potential of this mobile payment divide, according to Pew Research, 97% of Americans own a mobile phone. And according to the FDIC, 5% of households remain unbanked. Regardless of the nature of that, there's still a concern. And some states and cities have enacted laws to require that vendors accept cash, even though there is no such federal regulation. And this includes states like New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and cities such as New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. Finally, there is with mobile payments, there's a trade-off between their ubiquity and their seamless integration with tech platforms as non-bank companies and privacy. Tech platforms, as they move into the regulated space of financial services, will perhaps more squarely fall into the regulated domain that requires them to observe Know Your Customer, or KYC laws, and anti-money laundering laws, or AML. This is generally what this is surveillance of that banks and financial institutions are beholden to prevent criminal and terrorist financing. But the tech platforms themselves now kind of have a new vector for lawful intercept and other government interest in this data. I also think that there is an important question with mobile payments and digital identity in the United States. We're one of the few countries in the world, developed countries in the world, that do not require SIM registration. And I think mobile phone technology is viewed here as a medium for communication and is ostensibly a tool of free speech. So as digital identity moves closer to true physical identity, with tech platforms moving into the regulated financial services space, notions of privacy may be challenged on the part of the government and platforms both. I would also say that in lieu of any kind of federal data privacy regulation in this country, that there are some concerns with non-bank company tech platforms with interest in add to sale conversions and other aspects of data and its commoditization. Being able to observe the entire chain of a purchase and knowing everything in between as far as the intimate details of the financial lives of users is a concern. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Shen.
Thanks so much, Colin, for your presentation. So from now on, I'm going to cover the story from China. So my name is Shen. I am a system scientist at Carnegie Mellon. So for today's, I'll try to control my time. So for the rest of the 7 minutes, I'll cover the story of the rapid development and policy concerns around mobile payments in China. So this slide actually shows how mobile payments has become really infrastructuralized in China. So here I use the word infrastructuralized to refer that mobile payment system has indeed become a basic infrastructure for everyday users in China. So some data actually has shown that already in 2018, more than 80% of Chinese consumers are using mobile payments in their daily lives. While in the US, as of 2019, the adoption rates of major mobile payment apps was less than 10%. Although as Colin has covered, the pandemic has rapidly shapes the landscape of mobile payments in the US, but compared with China, China is still being framed as the cashless society. and also as the future of mobile payments could look like. So here are a number of reasons, here are a number of reasons we think that might contribute to the rapid development of mobile payments in China. First of all, China is indeed as a mobile first country. So as we did our research, China is actually very similar to many developing countries. That many people actually get on the internet don't really using their laptop, rather to using their phone. So the wide adoption of mobile phone and people's really like their daily use of mobile phone in their everyday lives actually have serve a fertile background for the growth of mobile payments. And also another interesting fact is China actually, its underdeveloped financial infrastructure has also played a role in the development of mobile payments. As we see that credit card penetration rate actually has been very low in China compared with other advanced nations. Like what Colin says, credit card has been very, very popular in the US, but in China, the situation is quite different. For example, the People's Bank of China actually reported in 2017 that the average number of credit cards owned per person in China is only 0.39 compared to 2.6 in the US. Another aspect I think it's very important is a policy aspect. In China, China's banking and the financial sector actually has long been tightly controlled by state regulators and dominant by state-owned banks. But since 2015, the Chinese state has gradually revised its banking and financial system to allow tech companies to provide many banking functions. But we also need to notice that the regulations have been tightening again recently, as indicated by the cancellation of Ant's IPO. Finally, I think it's also important to emphasize that there are platform efforts and human infrastructures behind the rapid adoption of mobile payments in China. For example, both Alipay and WeChat Pay offers massive financial rebates and utilize many local push teams to encourage the use of mobile payments in China. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I joked with Colin during our meetings, the picture of mobile payment system in China is actually very simple. Well, in contrast, in the US, his job to do the research is much more complicated. So in China, as you can see on these slides, actually the Chinese mobile payment market was dominated only by two players, that is the WeChat Pay and mobile pay. So WeChat Pay is the screenshot in the middle, and Alipay is a screenshot on the left. So in 2017, we saw like 15 trillion worth of mobile payments were handled by third-party platforms in China. And among them, Alipay controls 54% and WeChat Pay controls 40%. So collectively, those two apps has indeed become the duopoly of the mobile payments market in China, and which was regarded as the largest mobile payment markets in the world. So next slide, please. Okay, so this slide actually shows how the regular Chinese users uses those two apps in their everyday lives. And how relevant they have become for the Chinese society and the economy. As you can see from these slides, very different from the landscape in the US. In China, people are actually using those two apps in almost every aspect of their everyday lives. We see shopping online and offline becomes the top usage scenario. We also saw red packets, which it's a culture tradition in China. People tend to send money during holidays, birthdays as a way to say congratulations and best wishes. Now people are using Alipay and WeChat Pay to do those even culture traditions. In sum, here we summarized the different usage of mobile payment system in China across 3 domains. We saw people doing it in physical ubiquity. For example, they use it to pay their transportation fee, they use it to pay their dinner. And also we saw a second layer of digital ubiquity, which people are using that to do wealth management. And then finally, as I discussed before, there is a social ubiquity. People are using those payment systems to send out red packets. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide actually shows the specific mobile payment method that is very, very popular in China. This is called the QR codes. As Colin has already covered, that compared with the NFC chips that used by Google Pay or Apple Pay in the US, QR codes actually widely used in China. It's a cheap, quick, and easy way to conduct digital mobile payments. It has a very fast transaction speed, primarily than cash, and it reduces the amount of infrastructure required. For example, you don't really need to have a very expensive point of sale terminals. You can just, have a paper, print out a paper of your QR code on your booth, then the customers can scan that QR code. So everything is conducted in a very cheap, fast, and efficient way. And also, I think it's also worth to point out, Apple is only the 5th most popular smartphone brand in China, and a large number of Chinese users are actually building their mobile life on low-end smartphones from domestic brand, which don't really equipped with NFC chips. This also partially explains why QR code has become so popular, because even from the consumer's end, they don't really have the equipment to do an NFC transaction. They have to rely on a much cheaper and easy way to do that. And our data shows like 50% of our users use the QR codes at least once a day, and only 1% use NFC on a daily basis. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I summarize some policy implications from the Chinese perspective. First of all, I think it's quite apparent that there is a policy question around corporate duopoly in China, since Alipay and WeChat Pay's position as gatekeepers can really cause problems for other service providers and posing a potential barrier to entry. I think the Chinese regulators has recently rightly realized the situation. So we saw a series of anti-monopoly movements in China. And
I'm sorry,
and
if I interrupt you, but you clearly exceeded the 20 minutes.
Yeah, sure. This is our last slides.
Okay.
I will be done in a minute. Okay. We also saw some regulatory dilemma happen in China, potentially because of the trans-regulatory natures of some wealth management tools inside Alipay and WeChat Pay, such as in the case of Yuebao. And also, we also realized because mobile payment system has been so widely adopted in China, it actually creates some additional challenges. For example, we saw elderly citizens in China don't really have a capacity to use mobile pays in many of the scenarios in their daily lives. And because lots of actually public services in China right now required to use mobile pay, so potentially it creates a mobile payment divide, especially for marginalized populations in China. And also, finally, there is the trade-offs between ubiquity and privacy, as Colin already covered. In China, I want to emphasize that people's perceptions of privacy varies greatly from culture to culture. So in China, it doesn't really seem to be a huge problem, but potentially the outward expansion of those two payment apps will generate lots of privacy concerns in other countries. So that summarized our talk. One quick note. So this is really a preliminary version of our comparative study. So we welcome any thoughts, comments from the audience, so for us to improve the research. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Without further delay, I would like to invite the presenters of the last topic to share their slides. We will have Professor Chen, an assistant professor of the School of Journalism and Communication, as well as Professor Ying, as a professor of the School of Journalism and Communication of Xiamen University. You do have the floor. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Chen. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communication in Xiamen University, and my other two co-authors are Shubing Wu, who is a postgraduate student, and Ying, who is a professor in School of Journalism and Communication. They are my colleagues in Xiamen University. So I'm very glad to be the final president of this conference, but I have to confess that this research is incomplete. This is still an ongoing research, and our data set is incomplete. So after briefly introducing the background and the methods of this research, I will present some preliminary analysis and seek for comments and criticisms. So for the background, actually the presentation by Colin and Shen Huang already laid out the background for our research. We have a lot of overlaps with their research, but I will briefly repeat some of the background. The paper was one of the first specialized digital payment services in the world. It was launched in the US in 1998. However, compared to China, the adoption of digital payment in the US is relatively slow, and by 2019, 73.4% of smartphone users in China have used digital payment services. This figure also cited by Colin and Shen's research. And in contrast, in the US, the figure is 14.1%. But in the world, I think the trend is that the adoption of digital payment services is rapidly rising across the world. And in China, as Dr. Shen already mentioned, is already infrastructuralized in Chinese societies. So in Shen's another paper, Shen and her colleagues another paper, they examined the infrastructuralization process of WeChat Pay in China based on interview data. So thanks to Dr. Shen, this paper has inspired our research. So a brief literature review on the research of mobile payment. So in general, mobile payment service systems are rooted from specific social, cultural, economic, and regulatory contexts, and in turn have implications to local societies. And focusing on WeChat, there are many studies examining the social cultural factors of WeChat Pay. Particularly, anthropologists are interested in the sociality associated with digital money afforded by WeChat Pay, as examined by Tom McDonald. He has many works on the social cultural factors of WeChat Pay. And there are also other studies along this direction. So besides the social and the cultural, also there are research focuses on the policy and the governance perspective, and our research will follow this direction, and we hope to use empirical data to dig a little bit deeper. So to examine the mobile payment service, the regulatory context is important, and in China there is a self-sustained social media ecosystem in parallel to that of the West. That is, many Western platforms have their Chinese counterparts. For example, Twitter and its Chinese counterparts Weibo. And more recently, also many Chinese platforms has gone international, like Douyin and its international version TikTok. So these Chinese platforms are in the parallel legal universe governed by very different regulatory forces compared to their counterparts in the US. And according to Huang and Lebato, the regulatory tradition in China is a state-centered paternalist approach, and in contrast, in the US, it has a liberalist self-governance tradition. But more recently, we can see the development is that both in China and in the US, the governance approach are evolving to a co-regulatory framework. And what's underpinning the China's internet governance is the techno-nationalist ideologies, as argued by many scholars, especially for Chinese information and communication technologies. So this ideology views advanced technology as the national asset and as the key for the nation's economic development. So for China's development and for China's internet development and internet governance, it's evident the techno nationalism has supported many digital infrastructure. For example, the Internet Plus campaign. It is underpinned with discourses such as Chinese Dream and national rejuvenation. This is an example of how techno-nationalism shaping China's internet development. And for the development of mobile payment service, plenty and data science research show that it's also shaped by the techno-nationalism. So the WeChat's infrastructuralization in Chinese societies has supported by the Chinese government. It becomes the nation's infrastructure, and mobile payment, which is WeChat Pay, is a key feature in this process. So inspired by previous research, we are interested in the interplay between mobile payments, platform expansion, and regulatory contexts. So we have seen a lot of research around WeChat and around WeChat Pay. However, to date, we have found little research, academic research about Facebook Pay. Perhaps because Facebook Pay was released in 2019, and it is still a young function in the platform of Facebook. But how WeChat Pay and Facebook Pay is comparable? First of all, from the surface level, so both the platforms are social media platforms, and they developed their payment systems based on their respective social media platforms. And both platforms has undergone a process of infrastructuralization. So for WeChat, it's primarily infrastructuralized in China. For Facebook, its ambition is to the international market. WeChat Pay released much earlier than Facebook Pay. WeChat Pay released with WeChat 5.0 in 2013, and now it's China's second largest digital payment service, just followed Alipay. And it has 1.15 billion yearly active users. So according to the ranking of mobile payment services based on user base in this world, WeChat ranked number 1, followed by Alipay, Apple Pay, PayPal, and Samsung Pay. But for Facebook Pay, we couldn't find any publicly available data on the number of its users. Although according to its official website, this feature is available on its 4 apps like Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and WhatsApp. So probably this is still a young function, and we don't see much data related to this feature. And in our research, we hope to find out more in Tencent's annual reports and Facebook's annual reports. So we collected Tencent's annual reports from 2013 to 2020 because WeChat Pay, this feature was released in 2013. And in their annual reports, we removed content irrelevant to the payment business of WeChat. And we combined all the content into one text, and we conducted a social network analysis with Gephi, and we also used Gephi for the data visualization. For Facebook, we collected all its annual reports. But before 2019, we found that there are very little content relevant to Facebook's payment business. And 19, there are more paragraphs about its digital payment, but still the text is too small, and it's not sufficient for the social network analysis. We just analyze the data manually. So first, let's look at the social network analysis of WeChat. This is a network for the text we combined from Tencent's 8 years annual reports. And this figure displays the co-occurrence between the word payment, 支付, and other words in Tencent's annual reports. So we can see what words have a close relationship with payment, and these words are service, user, business, like increase, platform, income, products, and group. So these words are highly connected with the business of WeChat, and it suggests WeChat Pay is an important feature for WeChat's platform expansion. And for this figure, it's the 8 clusters like divided from this network, and we found a small cluster in the preview of this network. It shows some topics about platform governance related to digital payments like anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. But this is only a small part in this whole network. It accounts for 5.02%. For Facebook Pay, we manually mapped out the development of this feature in the country, in this company. We found that as early as 2012, Facebook started to apply for money transmitter license in the US, and it was granted 1 year later. And in 2015, Facebook enabled a feature on Message, and this feature allows its user to send money to their contacts. Only after 2019, Facebook officially released Facebook Pay. But in its annual reports, it has more focus and more paragraphs on its digital currency project like Libra, and later renamed as DIM. And in its annual report, we didn't find like the word Facebook Pay, although this is in its official website. So I think Facebook has more international ambitions. So it want to develop the digital currency project and has paid less attention to its like digital payment feature, Facebook Pay. So as I mentioned before, the data set is still incomplete, and we are still working on this research. But for some preliminary conclusion, we can see WeChat Pay has developed on a relatively immature Chinese banking infrastructure. It compensates with the existing banking infrastructure in China, and its payment feature is highly associated with the platform's expansion, but its expansion is primarily targeted at the domestic market. Although all internet companies are born globally, like in the technical sense. But for Facebook Pay, this feature is established on a relatively mature banking system in the US, and it has little room for this feature to develop, but it has the international ambition. So in its annual report, it has much more paragraphs on its digital currency project. For some similarities, we in both Facebook's and WeChat's annual reports, we found we found the word anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, which suggests the common challenges posed by digital payment in the global internet governance. So the next step, we will collect more materials, and we plan to web scraping some news reports relevant to Facebook Pay and WeChat Pay, and hopefully we can improve this research in the future with more data. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much also for this third presentation. I think we have really heard 3 very rich presentations. As you are aware of, Milton and Dick have not only asked me to play the role of a moderator, but also to play the role of a discussant. And therefore, I take the privilege to make a couple of remarks to the 3 presentations, and afterwards I would like to open the floor. And I do it in the sequence of the presentations as we have heard. Then I start with a digital currencies presentation of Ying and Roujing. I think that this presentation has really opened a very large scope of discussion points, since this presentation has somehow gone to the basic of a financial system. Digital currencies have been qualified as new focal point of the strategic game between China and the United States. Digital renminbis have been considered as a strategic move. I would like to come back to this basic statement in a minute, but since I'm relatively familiar with this topic, I would also like to mention perhaps three minor points, because I would of course like to see that you are continuing to work on your paper and to publish your paper. My first minor remark concerns the term super sovereign. At least from a legal perspective, the use of this term is relatively risky, because if I see it correctly, you use this term in connection with stable coins, and stable coins in principle do not qualify as legal tender. So all of a sudden we would have a stable coin currency called super sovereign, above sovereign even, but the main characteristic of a currency, namely legal tender, is not given. Then I do have a question mark as far as Liberty is concerned. You called them the biggest competitor of the digital renminbi. I don't think that this scenario is going to happen. At least if you look at the past, Libra has started as a very big project, and it has become slimmer and slimmer and slimmer, moved from Switzerland to the United States, as you have mentioned, and finally it is a stable coin only linked to the US dollar, and insofar the threat to other currencies, being renminbi or euro or whatever other currency, might not anymore be so substantial. And perhaps a third remark, you referred to the Silk Road, and I'm wondering whether the digital currency is really so important to the implementation of this project. I rather think financing, crowdsourcing, and other aspects are of more importance. This closes now my remarks, which I have said to be of minor importance. And I would like to come back to my introductory comment. If we look at digital currencies, digital renminbi, etc., I think we should ask the question, what network is likely to emerge in the future? And I think this could be an aspect that could be deepened in the further work on your paper. Probably, or it is likely, that such a network would be decentralized. However, as far as currencies is concerned, that's of course a challenge, because currencies should be applicable and it should be possible to use them on a global, or at least on a cross-border stage, and uncoordinated network approaches are somehow undesirable. Then CBDC network could bring policy diffusion effects, but may not necessarily lead to convergence in regulation. And finally, the regulation, of course, has to deal with the power balance, which you have mentioned in depth, which certainly could be an aspect of our forthcoming discussion. So overall, I think the regulatory response to the risks of digital currencies networks is really crucial. It is vital to avoid a race to the bottom in a digital currency network, and it should really be avoided that users are trying to take advantage of those digital currencies with the least regulatory requirements. So far, my comments to the first presentation. Second presentation given by Colin and Huang. I found the comparison very interesting. Let me start with a remark to the Chinese side. You correctly refer to the corporate duopoly, and if I try to build a bridge to the first presentation, I would perhaps then ask the question, will this duopoly be replaced in the future by a monopoly, namely the digital renminbi, a digital sovereign currency having legal tender? My second question perhaps goes more to Colin, but it concerns both presenters. If I understood your presentation correctly, you are of the opinion that mobile payment divides is not a dramatic problem in China, but it could become a problem in the United States, at least because the United States is somehow slower in the implementation of a digital sovereign currency. But in both countries, somehow the penetration rate of mobile payments and digital currencies around maybe 70%. So don't we have a digital divide for those 30% which do not use these means? And then, of course, from a European perspective, it is somehow unavoidable that I ask the question about privacy and surveillance. You also addressed this question. But what about anonymization? If I pay cash, I remain anonymous. If I use a digital currency, traces are always available. Maybe the answer could be different in the United States and in China, because China's tradition is somehow different. The widespread acceptance of an extensive and increasingly comprehensive use by the state of data can be observed, reaching a level that would be culturally and politically unacceptable in the United States, as I would assume at least it would hardly be acceptable in Europe, so to speak, my home space. And a fourth question would also relate to a legal topic, private acquisition and use of data, so to speak. Ownership of data becomes an issue if more data are collected by the state through data concerning payments. Could this become a problem? Do data subjects more or less lose their control over data if everything is collected either by the state or by big enterprises such as Facebook and other providers? And then finally, the third presentation, perhaps I could ask a similar question about a digital divide, and the question, who is really in a position to use the infrastructure? What about financial inclusion? And a second question concerns an aspect which is, of course, of utmost interest to me, doing a lot of work in internet governance. You have expressed the opinion that as far as internet governance is concerned, China is applying a top-down paternalism approach, ruled by directives instead of rule of law, whereas the United States and equally Europe would rather go for a bottom-up approach, including private actors in a form of co-regulation. Does such a regime really be appropriate for payment systems? Shouldn't we possibly have more governmental intervention in payment systems, because money is, of course, a very critical issue. I think I have now raised enough questions, and I would propose, since we have slightly more than half an hour for our discussion round, that I give the opportunity to each of the three presenters, if I take the two together in the first and the second round, somehow to take up one or two of my questions, and then I would completely open to the public. May I perhaps ask Ying to start, because you have been the first presenter.
能听到我说话吗，老师？
可以，你说吧，可以。
首先感谢韦伯先生。然后您刚才说的是，这个 DIM 就是 Libra， 它因为它改名了嘛，这个 DIM， 它是不是能够威胁到数字人民币的一个发展？就是从中国的角度，目前确实是把它作为一个威胁，因为现在还没有数字美元，或者是说其他的美国的央行数字货币。但从技术角度上，它一定是威胁，因为从我们的研究来看，这个 DIM 它采取的核心技术还是以区块链、非中心化的区块链为主的。但是数字人民币它不依赖就是单一的这种技术，然后它的一个问题就是，还有一个采取一个集中化的一个管理模式，这是从技术角度或者从制度角度或者制度标准角度，它是相悖的，然后是一种零和的一个关系。然后就是从一个市场的角度，其实我们来看，无论是数字主权货币，还是就是刚才我们说的数字支付，其实我们看它们的核心的价值是在于用户。而 DIM， 我们看 DIM， 其实我们要看 Facebook， 它这个全球拥有30亿，它这个用户基础啊。其实以后未来啊，这个主权数字货币、私人数字货币，它真正决定它的是什么？不是一个国家，也不是一个机构或者一个企业，它是市场。这市场的话，我们来看什么？尤其这种跨境的、全球性的一个金融一个基础设施，我们要看它的信用。当然 Facebook 现在有一些信用问题，因为用户数字保护，但是它目前它有这种巨大的一个群体，这一定是有巨大的优势的。然而中国现在它这个技术优势意味着什么？我是学国际关系和政治学的，然后在我看来，它是一种标准实力的竞争。因为它在技术上占有优势的话，那么它就有可能对中国想在国际标准上扩大它的影响力、它的话语权，它就有一个制约。从这个角度来，目前就是从中国的专家和学者，确实是把目前 DIM 这个超主权数字货币作为一个比较大的威胁。这是一个第一个问题。然后您刚才说了一个第二问题，一个监管的问题。其实现在的一个监管的问题，我觉得它的监管应该现在因为还没有是央行数字货币，还是在试点。中国还是说明年，然后在冬奥会上来试点。但是接下来我也是刚才听了另外2组一个专家学者，然后去探讨这个移动支付的问题，然后有一些灵感。我觉得移动支付其实它也是有一些国家性质，但是依然我可以在德国能够用阿里 Pay、Payback 我都可以用。那就说，如果他们这些机构，就如果主权数字货币，就是我如果以后可以在德国用数字人民币的话，那么数字人民币它就要遵守本地用户它的一个监管呀，一个数字保护的一些条例。但我想就是数字货币啊，私人数字货币、央行数字货币，因为现在还没有这个东西，就是我们想的那以后这绝对是一个比较核心的问题。这是我的对您的对我们论文的一个回应，谢谢。
Thank you very much. I would like now to pass the word to Colin and or Huang. You organize yourselves. How would you like to proceed?
I think I'll go first. You mentioned that with the mobile divide, I suggested that it would be a larger issue because there's a lingering preference for cash. That is indeed true, and certainly cash payments can kind of be a hedge against, invasiveness or prevalence. Surveillance. Certainly that also a certain degree of anonymity. But I think that this is an issue that is best tackled as mobile payments take more adoption in the United States, and we go increasingly cashless. We are going to have to wrestle with these non-bank companies as tech platforms that house our data, and how that is now going into the regulated domain of financial services. And we are going to finally have to probably wrestle with our own privacy law here in the United States, much like GDPR in the EU. I think this is an issue that will be kind of exacerbated by this growing trend. But as it stands right now, though, it's much slower than adoption rates in China. There's still a strong preference for cash and card here, and hence that's why in U.S. cities and certain states they are enacting laws on their level to ensure that vendors accept cash, because they are worried about shutting out some of these underrepresented, underserved populations.
Huang, would you like to add a couple of words?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Rolf, for the very insightful comments. It's indeed lots of questions me and Colin were thinking about, and also like I was thinking about those questions all throughout the research. So I do have like a few things to add on, especially I really appreciate your thoughts on the possibility of the emergency of a new monopoly to replace Alipay and WeChat Pay in China, and also the question around data ownership. So from my perspective, I think those questions are very insightful, but on the other hand, we need to view the possibility in the lens of the power conflicts and struggles between different state agencies and internet platforms in China. If you look at the recent re-regulation of internet fintech industries in China, then I think there is a possibility that state regulators push a little bit further than before, try to heavily regulate those newly emerged fintech platforms. So my suspicion is there is quite possible that in the future, a new arrangement of state-private partnership will probably emerge, but I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, because as I said, it's really depends on the power struggles between state agencies and internet platforms. This also relates actually with the question of data ownership. I think like in the past a few years, we saw the Chinese regulators try again and again to gain the control of the massive consumer data and also enterprise data that have been accumulated on Alipay and WeChat Pay platforms. But on the other hand, we also saw those internet platforms has power and capacity to some extent to resistant state control and regulations. And also we need to view this phenomenon in a multi-layer and multi-dimensional interaction way. So those platforms, they have high-level executives and they have representatives within the state apparatus. So it's not really state versus private internet platforms, but multi-layer and multi-level of interactions between those different type of platforms and state regulators. So I would say like the future is uncertain at this point. But I do think, Rolf, your comments are really insightful that there is a possibility that in the future, state will more heavily regulate those platforms as exactly what happening in the US and in the EU. So that's, I think, the shared global governance topic that exactly fits within like today's discussion of this panel. So that's my response. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful comment. Let me just add before I move on that we of course also see a shift in regulatory paradigm in China as far as financial institutions are concerned. For example, financial has become a systemically important bank, China, or the regulator has intervened against the planned public offering of its shares in late 2020 and has also levied a high fine against Alibaba. So we see a couple of changes which have happened on the financial market regulatory field in China. And now I would like to move on and pass the word to Chen for a short comment before I open the floor.
Okay, thank you, Rolf. I would like to respond to the financial inclusion mentioned by you. So far, I think how the digital payment service enhance financial inclusion. This reminds me of an argument from Shen Hong's paper. Traditionally, like many scholars have argued that for those who are unbanked, we can use digital payment services like for these people. So they will have access to banking through digital payment services. For WeChat Pay and Alipay in China, this situation will probably more complex because in China, if you want to use WeChat Pay and Alipay, first of all, you need to have a bank card. You need to link the bank card to your digital payment account. And as these payment services have become infrastructure in Chinese societies, it actually creates a new financial divide. Like for those people with low digital literacy or with for those who have prefer not using these digital services, they actually are excluded from this new digital financial system. Yeah, actually, this is an argument from Shen Hong's paper. Yeah, if you want to add more, Dr. Shen.
Okay, thank you very much. Now my privilege has expired, and I would like to ask the whole audience to raise questions. You have heard really 3 very interesting presentations, and I can assume that we do have many questions. Let me start with Milton.
Okay, thank you. I will actually have 3 questions, but I will just do 2 of them. They're both for Ying Huang and Roujing Wu. First of all, are there transnational network externalities in a sovereign digital currency? Clearly, there would be some pressure to build up these externalities, network effects domestically, but would digitization in any way improve or change the status of the renminbi in the global system, or would it simply leverage the level of existing of the acceptance, the level of acceptance of the existing RMB? And my second question is a simpler one. You said that China was excluded from international digital currency standard development. I just wanted to know how they were excluded.
Okay. Ying or Roujing, it's your turn. You have to unmute you. Okay.
谢谢 Miller 先生。然后我觉得人民币是数字人民币不会，目前看来不会帮助人民币改变当前的由美元所主导的全球金融和货币的一个结构。因为首先我们看到它在这个全球结构中它的一个地位还是非常。
Sorry, I'm not getting any English translation again. Are they on the wrong channel again?
你可以讲了，现在好了。
哦，好的，首先
你可以讲了。
好的，首先我是觉得，数字人民币的发展不会改变人民币当前在全球体系中一个比较弱势的一个法定货币的一个地位。首先这个货币它是一定是有主权，就是主权数字货币概念，也就是央行它发行的，它是一定是有主权概念在里面的。如果这个也是 Professor Müller 他在他的书里面写到，就是网络碎片化的一个过程。在我在研究过程中，我会想，每一个国家都来发展它自己的主权数字货币，每一个国家政府都想在数字货币上就是进行管理、监控、制定标准。这样的我们看到的情况下，就是一个全球的一个金融结构出现一个碎片化的一个岛屿化的一个现状。 它是不利于全球的一个数字经济一个发展的。至于美元其实它数字美元，它确实因为它是仍然数字美元、数字私人数字货币啊，还有主权数字货币，它都是在全球的一个金融一个结构里面运转的，所以说它的发展一定是建立在现有的金融结构基础之上。那么中国现在的一个发展数字货币确实是它的一个机会，它作为一个机遇，因为现在它是没有办法去改变这种地位，但是它又想在主权数字货币有更多的发言权，还有就是它想在降低美元在其国家还有就是它的主权、它的数字还有经济体系中的一个影响力。数字美元数字人民币它可以被目前被中国政府和一些专家作为一个机会，然后来扩大中国的一个影响。比如说是明年，就是我们又提到冬奥会，因为这个时候有很多外国人，然后如果用到这个数字货币，那么它的市场就慢慢就展开，占一个先机。但是至少就以后能不能改变不会，这是我的一个想法。
Roujing, would you like to add something?
Yeah, 就是quite speak in Chinese maybe. 就是我觉得就是从中国发行数字人民币来看，就是我们其实也可以参考，就是其他一些国家为什么会发行数字人民币，其实就是很多国家像是肯尼亚还有一些厄瓜多尔，他们之前也是有发展数字货币的。这些国家其实很多都是说为了去增强自己的就是追求金融科技发展，然后改善现有的体系。然后有很多国家也是说为了去抵制美国经济制裁，维护国内经济平稳的这样子一些体系。然后像有些国家也是说通过发行法定数字货币来稳定国内现有货币体系，来作为法币一个补充。所以我觉得就是说中国就是发布这个数字人民币，就是也是会有这样子的一个目的在的，就是对，这是我的一个想法，就是对。然后而且就是现在就是中国有那个丝绸，通过就是加强与沙特、阿拉伯，然后这个国家其实就是在一定程度上也是说数字人民币可以说就是说提升人民币的一个地位。对，这是我大概的一些想法。然后关于就是中国为什么就是说被排除在制定数字货币这一领域，我觉得就是黄颖可以再来就说下他看法，他可能会更专业一些。
标准好，谢谢。
他不是问你为什么，他是问你怎么样，怎么被排除之外。How is not why， 你 asking how。
对，他如何被排除的？因为现在日本啊央行，还有欧洲的央行，还有就是一些欧洲的一些国家，瑞典啊，他们这些国家一起来探讨这个规则。但是中国并没有要求中国来参加到这个一种谈判或者一种协调的一个机制里面。中国是一个人在关门来思考怎么样发展主权数字货币，怎么样去监管私人数字货币。我觉得就是这个其实从长远角度它是不利于中国数字人民币的全球化的，因为我刚才我们在报告中讲到，它的一个数字货币它是跨境的，它具有全球性。我们一方面我们要保证自己的数字或者是说就是传统的货币它的一个独立性和安全性，但是我们同时就像中国它是在技术上它在发展，它经济上允许它政策上也具有一些全球的维度。在这个时候他就说他接着下一步，就刚才柔静也补充非常好，就是数字丝绸之路它一个可以算作是一个威胁啊，就是对数字美元的一个威胁。我是认可这个，为什么呢？我具体的讲一下，就是这个如果中国在跟这个数字丝绸之路沿线的一些国家，然后在做生意的时候，我们如果用数字人民币来支付，它更安全、更便捷，或者是说它更成本更低，那么我们为什么不用数字人民币呢？但本来可以用美元的，但我们现在选择用数字人民币，这样的话，我觉得会中和，或者说就是会让货币权力进行分散。这个其实是 美元或者是美联储或者是美国一些专家学者最大的一个担忧。我刚才提到它这个结构性权利啊，就是我来制定标准，我来确定结构，你来参与到里面。但中国如何？他就是没有邀请中国来参加，这是大家一起讨论啊，央行数字货币。因为也是一种监管理念的不同，还有所采取的技术是不同的。大概就是这个回应。谢谢钱老师，谢谢。
我可以再补充一下，就是说它是如何，就是可能中国没有包括在这个体系内。就是首先是从探索阶段，就是中国它采用的技术，我们之前也讲了，它不是以单一区块链技术就是为基础的。其实在区块链推出之前，就是中国就已经就是说开始了这方面探索。然后呢，就是探索阶段，就是首先就是与可能大部分国家是不太同，然后从就是开始研究数字货币和这央行数字货币，然后在2020年的时候，其实英格兰银行还有与加拿大银行、日本银行、瑞典央行还有欧洲其他央行，他们是共同一起合作探索，所以说可以在就是央行数字货币发展初期，他们就已经说是可以达成，不管上是技术上还是说是其他可能法律法规上，可能都已经达成了有一定的共识。所以说就是从发展初期可能就是线路就会有一点点不同，然后就是再到后期到就是可能发行或试点，就是由于各国就是法律制度更加不同，所以就是可能会导致就是说中国就是这样子被排除在外。对，这个是我补充的一个想法，就也很感谢这个问题吧。
Okay, thank you very much for this insightful duet. But let's go on. Xiamen, the floor is now yours.
OK， 我想我用中文问吧，也是问这第一个 第一组的那个讲者，就是其实你刚才我们已经很深入的讨论过，就是为什么中国的主权货币不能就是在国际上取代美元。你们也讲得很清楚，然后我的问题就是说，那个尼玛，你们刚才也谈到，尼玛其实就是被中国的一些学者或者根据你们所说，就是作为一个主要的竞争对手。你们的 argument 就是其中一个就是两个，一个就是它的市场能力，就是如果 Facebook 它已经有几十亿的 user 的话，它通过它的一个 network， 它可能把它放上出去，这是市场的能力。第二个就是它的技术能力，它是一个我们讲的分散式的嘛，用那个就是类似于区块链的区块链的技术。但是我问题就是说，就算它是用区块链的技术，它就算它有几十亿的用户，但是所有的用户他的 data 还是他的处的地方还是在一个 physically 处在一个国家或者一个我们叫 jurisdiction 里面，对吧？一个管辖区里面。所以其实如果国家行使它的权利的话，它是很容易把这个东西切断的。他说我不让你进入，或者我不让你使用这个NIMA。在你这个主权的一个 physical 的里面，那这样的话它就断掉了，它就不会再就是被使用了。所以它如果要采取，如果比如说不但是中国或者印度或者其他的国家发展中国家，他们已经意识到这个威胁对它的一些威胁的话，他就可以去做。所以我想问一下，那其实到最后怎么样就是它能形成一个，因为始终它不是一个主权货币，它没有一个国家的货币作为一个 backup， 对吧？它是一个商业的性质的一个行为，所以怎么样它能变成一个主要的威胁呢？我还是不是太清楚吧。
柔晶，你先说吗？你先说。
我要不然就抛砖引玉，我就先说一点点我小小的看法，就是我们在 presentation 眼中就是也讲了，就是 Libra 它为什么改名成 DIM， 它就是其中有个原因就是说，就是希望尽快得到美国政府的一个监管的一个批准嘛。其实就是说 DIM 它可能现在会更多带有一些政治化的一个色彩，就是在我观点看来，然后 DIM 也是从原来的与一篮子主权货币挂钩，像就是包括欧元在内与欧元美元挂钩，到现在就是只与美元挂钩，而且就是美联储它也表示，就是可能在之后推出的 Digital Dollar会与就是说 DIM 展开合作，所以说就是 Libra 作为超主权货币，就是可能会通过就是说美元这一个 channel 会来影响吧，就是我一点小的看法。对，就是
好，
就是 这是王颖看。
好，我回应一下钱老师的这个问题。确实是这样的。我来说一下，其实我们刚才说市场是一个竞争关系，技术是一个竞争关系，最深层制度是也是一个非常重要的关系。刚才说，其实我们来看主权数字货币和私人数字货币，一个是去中心化，一个中心化一个管理，一个去中心化管理。这里就涉及到数据管理的一个规定。我们现在就可以说一个非常典型的例子，摩拜单车 Mobike， 它其实2018年其实在欧洲市场发展的很好，但是就是它不符合欧洲的一个数据管理规定，然后就被 pass 掉。那如果中国现在就是虽然数字人民币它起步早一点，但是接下来我们来看它的市场，如果没有市场，或者说它没有符合国际数字货币的一个标准，就是制度不符合不兼容，那中国数字人民币是没有市场的。可以借助一些数字丝绸之路上的一些国家，然后扩大影响，但它的影响是绝对是非常有限的。这当然我们说是制度竞争，其实这里面我觉得标准竞争是非常不愿意说的一个东西，就是意识形态上的竞争。然后其实我们来看，无论是数字货币，还有就刚才我们说的是移动支付这些东西，其实中西他们是有不同的监管理念。这也是由于他们的政治制度，还有一个政府的功能，还有政府和市场之间的关系所决定的。那如果是在这种背景下，就是我们看，中国会被视为一个不是合作者，而是竞争者，而且是制度上的竞争者，而且是意识形态上的竞争者。所以说，我觉得不仅仅是技术，接下来它应该是战略层面的一个中美的一个博弈的下一个焦点。谢谢钱老师。
但是我个补充的问题，那 Libra 它扮演一个什么角色呢？就是这种，它就是你觉得它是一个政治或者就我们讲区域政治的一个工具吗？
好，当时那个 Facebook 那个他的总裁 Zuckerberg 对吧？是 Zuckerberg， 当时他就说，当时美国监管部门就是不允许这个 Libra 的项目。首先，他一直在瑞士，因为他超越了美国的监管。后来他就从美国转到从瑞士转到美国。你说中国怕什么？中国怕他就是当时他说了一句话，他说：“你美国如果今天阻止我来做 Libra 这个项目，是谁来做？那就是中国来做。就是说，如果就是我 Facebook 不做，中国来做，走了先机，那美国的就是在数字货币方面就会很被动。老师，这个超主权数字货币啊 ，Libra 它的可怕之处也在于它的标准权利，因为它是超主权的数字货币，它有市场有技术。那如果它的市场和技术就是它要中国，其实他们都想要市场，就是有一种竞争关系，技术不一样。然后我觉得这中国现在也是比较怕 Libra 的，但是。从美国角度，就比如说我可以利用 Libra 然后对抗中国数字人民币的影响，但现在中国数字人民币还没有全球的维度，所以说从今天看，我们看可能是 Libra， 以后可能是 Fiat， 也可能是 Digital Dollar， 这不知道，因为什么？其实我们就是补充一下，我们现在没有说数字美元，当然它是央行数币，我们现在不能说是数字美元和美国央行数字货币，它是两个不一样的东西。美国现在美联储还没有自己的主权数字货币，就是说也有很多计划，但最后它叫什么名字我们都不知道。但我们现在知道的是什么？就是 Libra。这个 Libra 它是超主权的数字货币。中国其实它是想跟 Libra 就是然后我们是不是也可以有些某一程度上的兼容，我们也可以共享。但是 Facebook 它这有更多层面，就是它其实在中国是并不受待见的，所以说它也是希望就是在这个方面，然后跟中国竞争。而且我们看到美国的企业在这上面确实有很多的优势，在私人数字货币发展方面，而且中国又对私人数字货币又这么保守，中国不可能就是允许这种私人或者超主权数字货币在中国这种就是
对。然后我想打一个就是不太恰当的比方，就是 之前就是他们就是做相机嘛，就是我忘记是，反正是柯达相机什么的，反正就是做得很好。但是就是它这个相机这个产业逐渐落幕，其实是因为智能手机它的摄像功能就是越来越好，然后呢，就是把这个相机给打败。我觉得就是这样子的比喻可以用来就是来衡量就是主权和超主权货币的一个关系，就是打败你的有时候不是你同行的或者说同个类别的一个对手，有可能是其他行业的一个，就像餐饮行业一样，就是实体的餐饮业它是可能是被外卖这种被就是打败，就是一个就是我觉得可以类比的一个东西，就不知道大家是一个什么样的意见。
Thank you. Okay, I have no more questions. Maybe we can invite other questions as well.
I know how difficult it is to look at the chat and at the same time to answer questions. There was a long remark in the chat, which I tried now to answer. It concerns the question whether we are not going to compare apples with oranges, because on the one hand, we do have payment systems established by governments or central banks. On the other hand, we do have the banking retail systems. My reply would be, indeed, things are even more complicated, because if we are thinking of future digital systems and payment systems, then we have to distinguish between retail systems on the one hand and systems between the national central bank and the commercial banks. And as far as the second network is concerned, it is possible to say we have some similarities with the special drawing rights of the IMF. As far as retail digital payment infrastructures are concerned, we are not comparing apples with oranges if we do a comparison with a traditional banking retail system. So my short answer to this question is now almost 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the States. Are there any additional questions, or should I hand back my mic to Milton?
There's one question in the Q&A. You have to click on it to see it.
Well, I'm afraid again it will have to be a question to Ying or Roujing about the Bitcoin in El Salvador. How does China react? Is this a challenge?
柔静，你要说吗？
是我
他在那个。
等你要不然你先说下吧。对，
我来说。其实中国对这个您说这个Bitcoin，中国对 Bitcoin 就是对这个叫 Bitcoin 比特币啊，然后它的一直都没有改变，就是中国不承认它，然后就是对它严加监管，但是呢，就是说允许它的存在，但是中国不支持，因为它非常不稳定。然后最主要的原因就是中国是无法控制它的影响的。就是在这种情况下，中国其实中央集权，它是希望对这个私人数字货币，就是这种事件基本上不会影响到这个厄瓜多尔啊，它对比特币的这个基本上不会影响到中国对私人数字货币或者对加密货币它这种基本的态度。
Okay, thank you very much. Now I definitely hand over back to Milton for the closing ceremony. Please, Milton.